With Murders at Karlov Manor being set in the plane of Ravnica, it is no surprise that the set is full of legendary creature cards. There's 25 of them to be exact. And with 25 legendary creatures, there has to be a few that are going to be awesome for Commander. So what I'm going to be looking at are the 3 coolest Commander cards from the new set, and I'm going to talk about how I would build those Commander decks. No, it is not going to be Niv Mizzet Guild Pact. Niv Mizzet is probably just going to be a 5-color good stuff deck, and that's just not fun to me. So let's talk about the 3 that I think are the coolest commanders from the new set, which is going to be Dimir Guildmaster Lazav, Gruul God Anzrag, and Ravnica's own thug, Krenko. So first, let's dive into Lazav. Lazav, Wearer of Faces, is a blue and a black for legendary creature Shapeshifter Detective. It's a 2/3. Whenever Lazav, Wearer of Faces, attacks, exile target card from a graveyard. Then investigate. Investigate means you create a clue. When you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn. Very neat effect because, again, you attack with Lazav, creating that clue, which you can sacrifice for 2 mana to draw a card. And then you can also turn Lazav into something neat, which is something you exiled with it. So what you want to do is you want to maximize the effect of exiling cards with Lazav and turning it into something really strong. So first step to the Lazav success is filling the graveyard. There's a few cards here that I would love to include if I want to fill graveyards. First off is Mesmeric Orb, which is an artifact for 2 mana. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card, which is just a really great way to make sure you fill everybody's graveyards. They tap for a few mana, put a mana dork on the board or an artifact. When their turn comes back around and all that stuff untaps, they mill that many cards. Cruel Somnophage is also a really solid inclusion here, which is a creature with an adventure side and a creature side that are both really relevant in a deck like this. The sorcery side that allows you to mill 4 cards at the target player. Milling 4 cards in a 100-card singleton format is not necessarily super effective, but again, you might add a little bit of mill to the mix. You never know what you might hit. More importantly is the creature side here. Cruel Somnophage, power, and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in all graveyards. So as you keep milling everybody, including yourself, you start adding a lot of stuff in graveyards, and that's when Cruel Somnophage becomes really strong. If Cruel Somnophage is in the graveyard, you can target it with Lazav and make Lazav swing for a lot of damage. Later in the game, that could mean that Lazav might swing for lethal commander damage in one go. It's a possibility. Breach the Multiverse is another just really solid inclusion. In reality, you play Breach the Multiverse in probably any black deck at this point, but especially in a deck that cares about the graveyard, being able to make each player mill 10 cards, then put some creature or planeswalkers on the battlefield from their graveyards, and leave something in the graveyard for Lazav to hit is all in all just so much value. So once you fill the graveyards, you got to make sure you get some clues too, because just attacking with Lazav to get that clue might not be sufficient. You want to add some more clues just to make the value and make sure that Lazav hits more frequently with those triggers. Sometimes you don't want to have that on attack. Sometimes you might do it pre-combat. So first off, we got Secrets of the Key. It's an instant for 1 mana. It allows you to investigate. And then if you do it from the graveyard, there's a flashback cost and allows you to do it again. Drag the Canal is a new spell that comes out with this set. Most times it might just make a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, but if a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, Servile 2, then investigate. So the Servile 2 allows you to fill the graveyard. The investigate allows you to create a clue token, which is really 2 really solid effects on 1 card for a deck like this. So Dragon Canal is a really solid inclusion for getting clues for the Lazav deck in general. Another 2 cards that are really cool if you have a more artifact-based deck. So if you run a lot of artifacts, Forensic Gadgeteer will get you a ton of clues. It's also in the new set Murders at Karlov Manor, and it's a creature that says whenever you cast an artifact spell, you investigate. So anytime you cast an artifact, you get a clue as well. Activate abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate, meaning that your clues will pop for 1 mana instead of 2, which is also really, really awesome. Senator Peacock is coming out with the clue special release, if you will. Senator Peacock is a creature that says that artifacts you control are clues in addition to their other types and have that for 2 mana, you can sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. So effectively turning every artifact you control into a clue. So Senator Peacock is also a really great inclusion if you have a more artifact-based build for Lazav. And it also says whenever you sacrifice a clue, target creature can't be blocked this turn. So you effectively make Lazav have full evasion. So Senator Peacock in a more artifact-based Lazav build is super powerful. So we filled the graveyard, we've created some clues. Now we got to make sure that Lazav actually survives. We've got a lot of effects like that in blue, especially. We've got like Shore Up, which is an instant that gives your creature hexproof until end of turn and allows it to untap it, so effectively giving it vigilance on attack. Swift Foot Boots is a commander staple that goes in pretty much any commander deck, giving it hexproof and haste, which is also nice because it allows Lazav to attack the turn you drop it. March of Swirling Mist and Slip Out the Back are great to phase out your Lazav if that's what you want to do, especially for board wipes, exile effects. That's a really good way to protect your Lazav. So March of the Swirling Mist and Slip Out the Back are really good inclusions. And then, of course, you're in blue, so you might just run some counter spells instead to protect your Lazav, protect your board state in general, or graveyards. So Counterspell and Offer You Can't Refuse are both really efficient counter spells to run. It's not the most fun inclusions, but hey, you're in blue, you've got to protect your stuff. And then we want to talk about some serious Lazav value. You don't just want to rely on your opponent's graveyards. You want to run some creatures that you want to hit as well. Cityscape Leveler is really cool to include in a deck like this because it's good in the graveyard with the Unearth ability, but also if you can turn your Lazav into Cityscape Leveler pre-combat, then whenever you attack with Lazav, you get to destroy up to one target non-land permanent. So it's a really cool way to get some extra hits in with your Lazav and make it just destroy some permanents. Aglazots, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Aglazots' Deepest Betrayal is also a really cool inclusion, giving your Lazav some flying and lifelink. When it attacks, making everybody discard. If they can't, you draw. When an opponent discards lane cards, you create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. The die effect is not necessarily something you want on Lazav, but all the other effects are really solid. The lifelink, the flying, making people discard, and then potentially making some 1/1 tokens. Archon of Cruelty is also pretty cool if you can do that pre-combat. When it attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, loses 3 life. You draw a card and you gain 3 life. I'm typically not a big fan of target opponent in a commander set because you have 3 opponents, but you can go after either the biggest threat, or if you're working together with somebody else, you can use it from a politics standpoint. All in all, it's just a really solid attacker with a solid attack trigger. Grizzlebrand is also a really solid one. This can be post-combat as well, but if you do it pre-combat or during combat, hitting for 7 commander damage is pretty solid, with the lifelink especially, and then being able to draw 7 cards for paying 7 life. You're in commander, you're going to have a lot of life, so if you just want to fill your hand multiple times and filter with the perfect hand, you can do that with Grizzlebrand. Gix is also really cool, being able to hit, draw a card, but especially later in the game if you have that activated ability. Discarding all your cards and then being able to play stuff from the top of one of your opponent's library is really neat. Jin Cataxias is a very sneaky one, because if you target it with it, the beginning of your end step happens. The triggers, the way they play out here, is your Jin Cataxias will trigger before your Lazav turns back into Lazav. So that means that at the beginning of your end step, you draw 7 cards, which is really cool with Lazav. Also, you might be able to play out with the timing of when Lazav triggers and messing with your opponent's hand size. So Jin Cataxias is a really sneaky inclusion here that could really play out well if your timing is right. And then, of course, in a deck like Lazav, you're going to want to run Agatha Soul Cauldron, because ultimately, instead of just going off of Lazav's triggers, you're going to be filling graveyards with a lot of valued creature cards. If you don't want to just have Lazav be able to turn into some stuff with abilities, you can target Agatha Soul Cauldron on some of your other creatures. So effectively, you're just going to be copying really powerful abilities, putting them onto Lazav or other creatures, if you will. So that's how I would build my Lazav. So let's go to the next one. Let's talk about Krenko, Baron of Tin Street. For 2 and a red, it's a legendary creature goblin. It's a 3/3 with haste. You can tap it, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. Whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 red. If you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains haste until end of turn. So effectively, what you can do is you can sacrifice an artifact with Krenko, then pay a red, and put a 1/1 goblin creature token on the board with haste. So Krenko is a goblin creator and buffs your goblins both at the same time. Really nifty little abilities for another goblin commander. And goblins is just fun. You just put a lot of goblins on the board and you just start swinging. So what do you want to do? First off, you want to get some treasures. Because again, if we look at Krenko, we want to sacrifice artifacts. Treasures are the easiest one to create. But also, we want to have a lot of mana so that whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, I can put goblins on the board. Keep in mind that it says whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, not when you put an artifact into the graveyard from the battlefield. So it's any trigger from anybody. So if you have other players cracking clues, cracking treasures, foods, whatever that may be, you can activate Krenko to put goblins on the board. So you want to have plenty of mana to do that. So let's talk about treasures. Of course, we got two really good goblins that create treasures. Dockside Extortionist is obviously the most notorious one. It's also really expensive, so I understand if you don't want to include it, but it's a really, really solid card in a deck like this, especially. When it's the battlefield, you create X treasure tokens or X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. So you play Dockside Extortionist, typically you're looking at least half a dozen to a dozen treasures you're going to be creating. In a deck like Krenko, that is incredible, and that's going to set you up for a lot of success. Breach's Eager Pillager is a really cool new goblin that we got in the previous set. It has First Strike. When a pirate you control attacks, you can choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn, and that's when you create a treasure token. There's a lot of goblin pirates. Dockside Extortionist is a goblin pirate. So you'll probably be able to trigger breaches pretty quickly and pretty efficiently, but mainly the one we're interested in here is creating a treasure token, which breaches can do that for himself. Of course, we got Fable of the Mirror Breaker that creates the treasures. Also, the 2/2 that it creates upon entering the battlefield is a goblin, so it's even more relevant. And the backside is a goblin as well. So Fable of the Mirror Breaker is an awesome inclusion. Big Score is just a really solid, easy to pick up instant that creates 2 treasure tokens and allows you to kind of filter your hand. So really solid inclusion in a deck like this. So now we've got a lot of artifacts. We want to make sure that we can destroy some artifacts too, because we can't just rely on cracking our own treasures. We don't just want to rely on other players doing that as well. So we want to make sure that we destroy some artifacts in the process. Luckily, red does that pretty easily. We got Brotherhood End, which is a 1 in red and a red for sorcery. I'm not too interested in the board wipe side of things because we might wipe our own board if we do that. Most goblins are not that big, but destroying all artifacts with mounted value 3 or less is pretty solid. Now, if this is the route you want to go and you've already created some treasures, make sure you float your mana first because you're going to blow up all your own treasures as well. Not the end of the world, but you got to be prepared for it. So if you blow up all your opponent's mana rocks, tokens, whatever that is that they have as artifacts that are mana value 3 or less, make sure you float all your treasures before you do that. Anzrag's Rampage is a really cool one in this that's coming out this set, and I'm going to read it to you because it's new, so I'm sure not everybody's familiar with it. Anzrag's Rampage is a 3 in red and a red for a sorcery that says destroy all artifacts you don't control. Then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. I'm not super interested in the second part of this card, but being able to destroy all artifacts you don't control kind of takes that downside of Brotherhood End away. You destroy all your opponent's artifacts, but you keep all your treasures so you can use your mana the way you want to. Then exiling and potentially getting a solid goblin on the board for a turn. That's cool, but I'm only mostly interested in blowing up all my opponent's artifacts. And Anzrag's Rampage is really good at that. Then Gleeful Demolition is a really neat one in a deck like this. For 1 red, you destroy an artifact. If you control the artifact, you create 3 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. So you can either destroy an artifact of your own to create 3 goblins, which in a goblin deck is pretty relevant, or you can blow up one of your opponent's artifacts and then do the Krenko thing of paying a red, creating a goblin, all that stuff. This you will probably target your own artifacts with, but you never know. If you opponent has a portal of Phyrexia or something stupid on the board like that, being able to blow it up with 1 red is also really solid value. So Gleeful Demolition is a really neat little card in a deck like Krenko. So we've got Krenko as an engine. But if you're going to play a Goblin deck, you want to play some solid Goblins alongside it. So these are some good options. Roaming Throne, such a good Goblin. Roaming Throne is kind of one of those that anytime you build a commander deck, you're going to throw in Roaming Throne now. But in Krenko, it's another inclusion that I wanted to mention. Being able to play a Roaming Throne, turn it into a Goblin, you're going to be able to get double triggered abilities. So with Krenko especially, if you tap it to give all your stuff +1/+1, you actually give them 2 +1/+1 counters. Or you get to create 2 goblins if an artifact leaves the battlefield. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with Roaming Throne just with Krenko alone. But again, there's also other goblins that have cool activated effects or triggered abilities that Roaming Throne would enhance. So 2 other really good goblins I want to talk about is Krenko Mob Boss. Krenko Mob Boss, you can tap, create X/1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. That's already really solid because we're already going really wide. But with Roaming Throne, that would double the amount of goblins. What's better than 1 goblin? 2 goblins. So obviously, Roaming Throne, solid inclusion, but even if you don't have Roaming Throne on the boss, Krenko on the field, you're probably going to have a ton of goblins to create with Krenko. Krenko Mob Boss is a solid inclusion here. Muxus, Goblin Grandee, is also a really, really powerful goblin, more on the top end of the goblins you're going to be playing. But especially in a deck like this, where you're going to be playing a lot of goblins, but also have a ton of goblins on the board, Muxus will enter the battlefield, and when it attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each goblin you control. You're going to have a ton of goblins, so Muxus is going to be able to swing for a lot. But you don't just want to have Muxus hit hard. You want all your goblins hit hard. You're going to go wide. Well, luckily, Red has a lot of Anthem effects, and there's a lot of Anthem effects in goblins. Goblin Trashmaster, for example, is a really good one. And it's especially good in this deck, because Goblin Trashmaster allows you to sacrifice a goblin to destroy target artifact. So you can choose to destroy or sacrifice one of your smaller goblins that hasn't had all the +1/+1 counters yet or whatever, and destroy an artifact to then trigger Krenko if that's what you want to do. Now, that's kind of sacrificing a goblin to create a goblin, but maybe it's one of those where your opponent just has a really powerful artifact on the board that you want to destroy. Being able to take that out by sacrificing a goblin only to then create a new goblin just feels like really good value. Other goblins you control get +1/+1. And we got the Goblin Chieftain that gives your goblins +1/+1 in haste, which is super relevant because then every time you create goblins, they gain haste. Now, the ones you create with your commander are already going to have haste, but there might be other triggers that create goblins because a lot of what goblins do is get more goblins on the board. They're kind of like bunnies in a way. And we've got Runfeld Horde Master, which is also a more recent one from this last year. Other goblins you control get +1/+1. Whenever it or another goblin you control dies, you exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin creature card, you may cast that card until the end of your next turn, which is really solid. It doesn't say that the goblin that dies has to be non-token, so it could be one of your tokens. You're going to have a ton of them, so this will trigger quite a bit. More Anthem effects here. We've got a Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, which again gives your goblins +1/+1. You can have Hobgoblin Bandit Lord deal damage equal to the number of goblins that enters the battlefield under your control this turn to any target. So if you have a lot of goblins entering the battlefield, your Hobgoblin can then just ping something or someone for a lot of damage. Icon of Ancestry is just really great in any kind of typal deck. Obviously, you'll select goblins. Your goblins get +1/+1, and you can filter through your deck for 3 mana to try to find more goblins to play. Ferocity of the Wilds is also really good enchantment in a deck like this. It's a little expensive for 3 mana, but given all your goblins, +1/+0 and trample is really, really great. Again, you're going to go wide, you're going to do a lot of damage, but also the trample is really relevant on some of your bigger goblins like Muxus. Even more Anthem effects. Castle Embereth, really solid land that you can tap for it and 3 mana to give +1/+0 to everything. Mechanized Warfare is also really solid. If a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or permanent, an opponent that controls, it deals that much damage +1 instead. So just making your goblins, again, hit for 1 more. All these little +1/+1s and +1/+0s, they add up to a lot of damage because you're going super wide, is the plan anyway. City on Fire, an 8 mana enchantment. Are you out of your mind? No, I'm not, because it has Convoke. You're going to play a lot of goblins. They're going to be red. They're going to be able to tap for City on Fire. If a source you control will deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage instead. So now your goblins don't hit once, they don't hit twice, they hit 3 times as hard. So if you have a lot of goblins, you get a couple +1/+1 effects. Maybe they're all 4/4s. Suddenly they all hit for 12 damage. Game over. City on Fire is a really solid inclusion if you're going to go wide. So we've talked about Lazav. We've talked about Krenko. Lazav is very sophisticated. You create your clues, you select your creatures to exile with it, and you transform it. Krenko just goes wide and hits hard. Well, now that we've got those two, let's just go full Timmy and talk about Anzrag, the Quake-Mole. 2 a red and a green for legendary creature Mole God. It's an 8/4, for 4 mana. If you've seen my standard video where I talk about my top 10 standard cards, I also mention Anzrag and my absolute flabbergastness, if you will, about it being an 8/4/4. Whenever Anzrag the Quake-Mole become blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. For 3 red, green, Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So Anzrag, you want to play it, you want to attack with it, and your opponent's going to have to choose, am I going to block this? If I block this, my opponent, the Anzrag player, me, is going to be able to attack more. If I don't block it, I take 8 damage. That's commander damage in a game of Commander. So that is a very risky thing. You can only get hit by Anzrag 3 times effectively before you lose the game. So you got to be really aware of your choices here. So how do we want to build Anzrag? So first we want to protect the mole. We want to make sure that it stays alive so we can keep hitting with it. Luckily, green has a lot of things that can do that. Gaia's Gift is a good one because it gives it +1/+1 counter. So it's not just until end of turn. It also gains Reach, Trample, Hexproof, and Indestructible. So the Hexproof and Indestructible is what we're really interested in. But the Trample is really cool too because then your opponent has to choose to block or not. If they choose to block, then you respond to Gaia's Gift, or respond with it with Gaia's Gift, giving it Trample, making their block so much worse. Because then you trample over, and you get to attack again. It has Indestructible and Hexproof. So very, very powerful effect. Tyvar Stand is also really solid. I like that card a lot here too, because it gives it Hexproof and Indestructible, but you can also put some extra mana into it to make Anzrag even bigger. So you might be able to swing for Commander Lethal if you already got some points on the board there, or just for extra damage. Like Hajar Loyal Bodyguard in a deck like this, because you're probably going to be putting in some extra value Gruul cards, Gruul creatures, and you can sacrifice Hajar Loyal Bodyguard to give your legendary creatures +1/+0 and Indestructible. So again, making Anzrag bigger, making it Indestructible is really good. Heroic Intervention is obviously a great inclusion. I feel like you play that in any Gruul deck, but I just wanted to mention it here because, again, we want to keep our Anzrag alive. So we swing with the mole. We want to make sure it survives. Now do we want to make it bigger? So how do we make the mole swole? Xanago's God of Revels is a really great card because it also gives it haste. So if your Anzrag would die and you bring it back, you can attack with it right away with Xanago's God of Revels. Xanago's has Indestructible itself. As long as your devotion to red and green is less than 7, it isn't a creature, so it'll just sit there as an enchantment, which by itself is already pretty good. But what's even greater is at the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature you control gains haste and gets +X, where X is that creature's power. So your Anzrag will be swinging for 16 damage with Trample, which is really good. Oh, wait, sorry, this doesn't give it Trample, it gives it haste. My bad. But there's other stuff that we use to give it Trample. But just the 16/16 Mole God coming at you and having to choose whether or not. Sorry, it's not a 16/16, it's an 8/4, so it gets +8/+8, so it's actually a 16/12. Math is for blockers, guys, and we play Anzrag, we don't do math, we just swing for damage. Cut me a break. Anyway, you get the picture, Xanagos is a good inclusion. So Brandel, Hunger Dominance is also really cool because it doubles the power and toughness of each creature you control at the beginning of each combat. With Anzrag, we're going to be having multiple combats. That's the plan anyway. So we attack with Anzrag. It's going to be a 16-8. Then if your opponent blocks and you get another combat, it's going to be a 32-16. So it's going to instantly swing for lethal commander damage. So Zopandrel in Anzrag is a lot of value. Very cool card for a deck like this. And then, of course, Embercleave. We already know what Embercleave does. Giving it +1/+1, double strike and trample. In Anzrag, it's just absolutely nuts because, again, you threaten that lethal commander damage really, really quickly. So for 7 mana, we can make the opponent block Anzrag, but we're going to want to do other things with our mana. So let's be more efficient in making our opponent force blocks. Now, Enlarge is not the most efficient card, but given something +7/+7 and trample until end of turn, and it must be blocked this turn if able, is really, really powerful for Anzrag. So you're going to make your Anzrag a 15-11 with trample, and it has to be blocked. That's pretty solid because you're going to be attacking with it not once, probably twice at least, and maybe more times depending on how the blocks play out. So Enlarge is a really cool inclusion in a deck like this. Compel Duel is a little bit more efficient. It's for only 2 mana, giving it +3/+3, and it has to be blocked. Again, really solid way to force blocks. Doesn't give it trample, but again, we've got other stuff that does. Naeth of the Dire Hunt is also a really cool card in this, also because it's a legendary creature, so it synergizes well with Hajar. Whenever one or more creatures you control fight or become blocked, you draw a card. So you don't just make it to where your opponent has to block Anzrag, you also draw a card because they're blocked. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay 2 and a hybrid Gruul mana. If you do, double target creature's power until end of turn, that creature must be blocked this combat if able. That's really cool because, again, you force the block on Anzrag while making it double power. So it's going to be a 16-4. It has to be blocked. The only thing that's kind of a downside here, but I can't complain too much for only 3 mana, it only counts 1 combat. So they have to block your Anzrag to 1 combat. If you want to do it again, you're going to have to activate the ability again. But still, really, really solid way to make it to where people have to block your Anzrag. And you draw a card because they do, so even more value. So we've got Anzrag, we make it indestructible, we make it big, we make it force blocks. Now we want to optimize the value of our combat. So there's some creatures that are really good if they can attack, especially if they can attack more than once. Goldspan Dragon is just really solid because it's going to make those treasure tokens to tap for double mana. So Goldspan Dragon is a really solid inclusion in a deck like this just to create a lot of mana for value later turns. Even though Fairy Tale World Anzrag would survive the entire time, it probably won't. This is Commander. There's going to be 3 other players that are going to be targeting you with removal. So having more mana later on to use with Goldspan Dragon to bring back that Anzrag, rebuild your board, whatever, is going to be really valuable. Ilhark the Raise Boar is going to be our boar god. That's going to back up our mole god here because there's all kinds of really cool gods in Gruul. Ilhark is really cool because when it attacks, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and they stay on the battlefield until the next end step. So with Ilhark, you already get to play an extra creature that attacks, but if you get multiple combats, that means that Ilhark is going to put multiple creatures on the board that are tapped and attacking. Also, whenever it dies, you put it into its owner's library third from the top, and that's really good because you can keep bringing it back. Ilhark is just a really cool card, especially if you get multiple combats. Kogla the Titan Ape is really cool too, a little bit more niche, but again, it's just a solid inclusion. It's when it ends the battlefield, it fights a creature, which is already pretty good. But what I like here is that when it attacks, you destroy an artifact or enchantment defending player controls. If you get multiple attacks with Kogla, that means that you can pick off the biggest threat, artifacts and enchantments. This is going to be Commander. There's going to be some very powerful artifacts or enchantments on the board. And then, of course, we want to refill our hand. So Elder Gargaroth and Toski are both really good at drawing cards. So I like those inclusions as well. If you don't want to draw cards with Elder Gargaroth, maybe you just want to put some extra beasts on the board. Maybe it's later in the game you gain some life. That's probably not what you're going to be choosing. You want to be aggressive, so you're either creating beasts or drawing cards whenever you attack. So those are really, really all the inclusions that I can think of. So those are the 3 commanders I like the most and kind of an idea on how I would build them. As the screen here says, please make sure to like and subscribe. My analytics say that the majority of viewers here are not subscribed yet, so it would really mean a lot to me if you could hit that subscribe button. If you like videos like this, I like talking about cards, I like card rankings, and kind of talking about some cool commanders, how I would build them, that kind of stuff. So let me know in the comments if there's a commander that I left out that you're really excited about, and maybe some inclusions that you would put in, or an idea on how you would build it. But anyway, mention your favorite commanders from the new set in the comments. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching.